Welcome to Native Bidaské, Native News Online's weekly spotlight on the people making news and leading change in Indian country.
Welcome to another edition of Native Bidaské. I'm Levi Rickert, publisher and editor of Native News Online, and I actually have a colleague, one of our staff reporters, Neely Bardwell, with us today. How you doing, Neely?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Very great. And we have some really distinguished guests. Now, as many of you know, Native News Online has been covering the Road to Healing Tour. It's the Department of the Interior's Road to Healing Tour. We're going out into Indian country and letting Native Americans, the survivors and descendants of Indian boarding schools, come in and tell their side of the story and through listening sessions. And last week, actually, it was, by the time this is shown, it'll be 2 weeks ago, Deb Parker, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the, let me get this straight, the National Native American Boarding Healing Coalition, also known as NABS. She's with us today, and we also have Dr. Samuel Torres, who's the Deputy Chief Executive Officer for NABS, with us today. And they both were there in Arizona, and there were 2 sessions out in Arizona, and they were both at both sessions, and we saw each other out there. I thought it'd be great to have them on Native Bidaské this week. So welcome, Deborah and Sam.
Thank you. Thank you for having us today. It's a pleasure to be here.
And let me ask you a question. Tell our viewers your impressions of what you heard at those listening sessions in Arizona. I was there, and we heard some really grueling stories. And so, Deborah, we'll start with you.
Well, we this past week in Arizona, we were able to join the Gila River community as well as the Navajo Nation and their boarding school survivors, leadership, family members, and listen to their boarding school experiences. And so for us at the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, we were in attendance to share our love and support for the community, for survivors, for the children of the survivors, those who came forward to share their stories. We wanted to just let them know that this is our work. We're here to uphold, to listen, to help, just to let them know that we see them, we love our relatives, and we'll do what we can to help uplift these stories, uplift these truths, and just be there to comfort when needed. And so at the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, we refer to ourselves as NABS. We believe in truth, justice, and healing. So ultimately, we want to see our communities grow in strength and resiliency. So it was an honor to be there. There was difficult stories that we heard, and so we just we stayed in prayer, in love and respect, and so that was a little bit of our journey, but definitely an honor to be there to witness these stories.
And Sam, what were your impressions?
Yeah, thank you, Levi. Tlasokamati. And just want to say Tonalte no Chime, sending good energy to everyone out there right now listening. And I just want to share that, a lot has been said about how historic these listening sessions are. And I think it is important to recognize that the federal government and the Interior Department specifically, this is the first time that anything like this has ever happened, where the federal government is coming into communities, into nations, and requesting to hear directly from those impacted directly by the federal Indian boarding school policy, what their experiences were like. I think that is definitely profound, but just as important, if not more, is that folks are really bearing their entire spirit, their soul, their heart, their experiences out there on full display. The immense courage that we saw shared with everyone in community was truly powerful. And NABS, we have been at each of these instances. Levi, I'm sure you have seen that. We have had staff there at every one of these. Our intention has been pretty singular, is to support, to share space, and really to hold gently as best we can those survivors that are there. That's really our primary goal, is to make sure that when folks see us, they know that we can help offer a container and a safe space for them to be able to be with us. Quite often in each of these instances, with each of these locations, we have been invited to hold other conversations, even be invited to other folks' homes to be able to continue the process of sharing in a safe way, but also to explore, how we can improve for our people, for each other. And I think that's been a really important learning from these listening sessions. Yes, it is indeed historic that these conversations are happening, but it also presents, I think, an inherent challenge to these communities and nations, that once the Interior Department comes in to have these conversations and then they leave, the community now has this duty, this responsibility of figuring out, where do we go from here. These conversations are now out there, and there is a kind of a now a ground game that needs to be assembled to be able to hold folks, gently in this time, because once those wounds are revealed again, it's they don't just go away. And so I think we've had a lot of conversations about that. Again, being in community has been really powerful, offering our continued support and making sure folks have what they need, but also recognizing that so much more needs to be done. This is by no means the end of the road, but it's a important process in determining how the federal government needs to be held accountable for the federal Indian boarding school policies.
I think it's clear that what you guys do at the Healing Coalition is prioritizing healing, and I think what telling these stories, it's clear that there's damage that has been done to our communities through these boarding schools. So, as two individuals who are going about this centering healing, why is it important to share these stories about what our people went through?
Well, currently to date, we don't have the records that tell how many children went to boarding school. We are just learning about how many boarding schools existed. So for most Americans, they do not know the story of the boarding schools. They do not understand what happened in the boarding schools. Some reflect and look at these boarding schools as like a privilege and an honor to attend them because, okay, we provided education, um, children were fed, often the churches, and then the government will say, but we know the truth behind what happened at these boarding schools. There was sexual assault, violence. Some children were starved. They were starved. There were beatings. There were straps that locked children to radiators. So we know some of those stories that are not in the U.S. history books. And so we've heard continual stories of the hair being cut. Anytime the students spoke languages, they were hit, slapped, brutally punished, and then some kids just disappeared. They weren't ever found. So we don't know the location of some of those children, and others, they never heard from their siblings again. So that's the harsh reality. Those are the stories that are untold.
Yeah, and if I could just add, I feel like fundamentally, storytelling such as this, especially on the lands of the nations that have held these events so far, it's been really important, um, for fellow community members and tribal citizens to be able to see the courage that's being expressed, to understand these stories are being validated in real time and seen as real. I think for the longest time, many of these stories have, though they have existed in the hearts, the minds, the spirits of those that directly impacted them, and of course via the intergenerational trauma that descendants continue to carry, it hasn't been named in a widespread way, such as it has been now. And so I think for communities to be able to, and nations to be able to see their neighbors, their relatives, be able to show that courage. We've heard from folks in these events that have been sharing their stories for many years, but also folks that are starting to share their stories for the very first time. We also can't even really put a number on those that have yet to dive in and share those stories for themselves. And our hope is that as we can draw our strength together, that those stories can help empower our relatives, each other, to be able to walk on a path towards healing, because we can't heal from that which we cannot even name or describe or tell. And so I think in some way, shape, or form, these listening sessions, they offer a profound opportunity. Of course, the Department of the Interior being present provides a huge obstacle, right? It's a federal entity. We have the government, the United States government present. But on the other side of that, the Secretary of the Interior, she's an Indigenous woman. The Assistant Secretary is an Indigenous man. These relatives of ours also have experienced the horrors of the federal Indian boarding school policies. So there is a level of kinship that hopefully there is opening possibilities towards this storytelling to be able to have transformational possibilities. So I do think that these stories can contribute to healing individually, within community, within nations, but they also present opportunities for growth. How do we identify those gaps? Where is the work that needs to continue from this point? And so with that healing comes an extra level of responsibility. This is not where it should end. We have to take this forward.
Well, NABS has been around, and Deborah, if you don't mind, could you kind of tell our viewers how long NABS has been around and talk about the interaction that took place? My understanding is that once Secretary Holland established the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative, the Department of the Interior didn't feel like they needed to start over because NABS had done such great work in the past. So can you talk about that relationship? And then maybe the second part of that would be, are you working hand in hand with them now on a report that will be released about the road to healing? So but talk a little bit about the history of NABS first.
Absolutely. Well, NABS was created in approximately 11 years ago, and there were a group of tribal leaders from all over the country that came together to say, hey, look, the Canada is going through their process of looking at what happened through their residential schools. And so they're beginning those discussions. And so what's happening in the United States? And there was a silence that tribal leaders felt that we needed to examine, that we had a story to tell too. And we have a history of boarding schools that our children witness the same and experience the same atrocities that happened in Canada. And so the tribal leaders met at Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians. They met at the National Congress of American Indians, and they created what's now called the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. And so they wanted this coalition to be formed so that survivors, tribal leaders, and others can come together to kind of uncover these unknown truths, to help locate missing children, and to notify the government that we are well aware of what happened in these boarding schools, and we no longer want to carry that shame and that guilt, and we need to tell our story so that we can correct this history and provide a place for that healing, provide a place for that testimony to be shared. And ultimately, we want healing. We know that the boarding school has taken away our languages, has impacted our parenting, has really put us in some deep, dark places because of the shame and guilt that was, that our children went through. So many of our relatives didn't survive after the boarding schools. There were suicides. alcoholism, drug addiction. And so we witnessed that here today on our reservations, the impacts of the federal Indian boarding schools. And so for NABS, that has been our goal to uncover that painful past and start to find pathways to healing. And so really we're lighting the path forward to say, hey, dear relative, you matter to us. You are so important in our lives because these are our grandmothers, these are our aunts and uncles, and these are our ancestors. And so, many who didn't return, we want them to know we're looking after them. We believe in healing, and we want to create a better tomorrow for our children. So at NABS, we want to tell that story. We want to help our relatives heal, and we're looking out for the next generation so they have an opportunity to feel strong, to feel connected to their language, to our culture. And so for us, that's the most important piece to this is that that feeling that our relatives have received justice, that they've received healing through this process. And so NABS is fully committed to that. And we're a small team, so we're always looking for support from outside agencies and funders. And we are doing the best we can to make sure that we're doing outreach and public education and research. And so that's some of our vision and our goals. And we're growing quite a bit in the past year. We've included several staff members who have joined us to look at policy and legalities. We have a healing director now. So we're growing, and so just really hoping to reach the hearts, minds, and souls of not only the United States but beyond as well. Folks know that the Indian boarding schools wasn't what they claimed them to be. These were places that really destroyed Indian children and families and entire communities.
Sam, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And we take a lot of pride in being a small, close knit team, and we do have ambitions and aspirations of building this movement, of course, and bringing in, those agents of change and folks that we know can help support and build this movement. But we continue to just move with that grassroots energy. We have we owe a debt of gratitude to the no, countless number of people that have helped support where NABS has been at this point. We have to honor and respect those like Denise Lajmadir and Patricia Whitefoot and Henry Kagi, folks that were a part of this conversation. Marlene Helgamo, the late dear Marlene Helgamo, who we lost this past year, who made their transition. And so we have a debt of gratitude to those individuals that have allowed this project and this now coalition to be able to sustain this movement where we are right now. It's by no coincidence that these instances of history, starting with 2008 when the Canadian TRC was initiated, 2011 when the Boarding School Healing Project was formed by those leaders and many others, 2015 the report that was published by the Canadian TRC, and then of course just a couple years ago when the 215 plus from Kamloops was identified. NABS has been in this movement process for long enough to be able to see these historical markers and to see that none of this is happening in a vacuum. And we are ready to meet this moment as we continue to be able to move and build the movement. We signed an MOU with the Department of the Interior back in December 2021. And despite having a small team, we have been doing research on boarding school institutions, where boarding school data is in certain federal and non-federal repositories. And the Interior Department, after kind of creating their own investigative committee, realized that there was a lot more out there that they needed to learn. that's when it made a lot of sense for us to come together and to share some best practices, some very profound learnings that we have identified over the time. And then in that time, identifying 408 federal Indian boarding schools, all of which can be tied to federal money in some way, whether it be direct payouts, land trust, government certifications, personnel. But in addition, we also know that there are 112 other institutions. I'm sorry, 111 additional institutions that cannot be found to have been fully supported in any way, shape, or form. We know Christian missionaries, other independently financed institutions that were impacted by the federal Indian boarding school policies. That connection is there, even if those federal monies aren't connected, knowing that 509 boarding school institutions have been identified. It blows the mind to think about how large scale this system was. Nearly 150 institutions in Canada were identified, and 509 in the United States. So it is more than time for the United States as a government, as a people, as a nation, to be able to come to terms with this history and to put together a comprehensive fact-finding and a fact-finding process and an opportunity for survivors and descendants to be able to share these truths, as horrific as they might be. So we are continuing to meet with the Interior Department and continue to look at our data, to look at their data, and to be able to come together in other ways. They also know that we have a very important job of being able to provide them with feedback and criticism and critique. And I think that's been a really effective part of this relationship.
That's great. And one thing that struck me this past Sunday as we were at on the Navajo Nation was there were actually two women, two separate times during their testimonies, alluded to the fact, and one woman actually said that when she found out Deb Haaland had become the Secretary of the Interior, she prayed to God numerous times that there would be an opportunity for her to meet and be able to tell her story, and it came to fruition for her. And I was thinking about that after that now most of us are very proud of her, especially those of us, we cover the news, you guys do what you do, but those involved in Indian country, we really fully appreciate Deb Haaland. The idea that she's even the Secretary of the Interior. But I was thinking about that in terms of women who are Secretary Haaland's age and maybe a little older, just how amazed they are. And it's such a, how can I say, it's inspiration that Deb Haaland is even in that spot. Because I would argue there wouldn't even be a federal Indian boarding school initiative with Deb Haaland not being in that office. So that's just my comment. Hey, Neely, I'm going to turn it back to you for a question.
Yeah, and I think, the first step to healing, I think, is sharing and telling these stories, and allowing space for these survivors of boarding schools to share their story. I guess my next question, though, is how do descendants and others who may not have been in the boarding schools but are still feeling the intergenerational trauma and effects of that trauma that may not have directly happened to them, but you're still feeling the effects of that. So how do we, as descendants, center healing in our day-to-day lives in order to break these cycles of trauma?
Neely, that's a great question. I think that's the question of the day. Is we're left with wondering what happened to our relatives, and what do we need to do to understand and to be a compassionate relative. And it does start with examining our own history and talking to our elders, talking to our relatives, asking them what happened in the boarding schools. And for some of us, we may be met with unknown truths. Unknown stories. Like, I don't know. And so looking at records, having those records available, doing some research with your tribal office. Maybe there's a tribal historian, trying to find out what happened to your family members. And then also, once finding out, like, okay, our language, where's our language? What happened to our language? And how can we start to re-engage with our traditional language, and meet with your language speakers that are available. And I think that's bringing back that sense of connection to who we are as a cultural people. Our language is so incredibly important, and so start to bring back our language, find out what happened to our land. Some of the lands are owned by churches and private industries within our reservation borders, and let's find out the truth. Let's get our land back, and then also, there's so many ways to find that truth, find that justice, but that inner healing is so critically important. And I know it. For me, that starts with forgiveness. I thought at times my grandmother didn't love me because she wasn't able to communicate her pain. That pain that she went through was so great that it's better to be silent and to go away, to shut themselves in a room or someplace where no one will hurt them, or they won't have to share the pain that they went through. So trying to open up those doors to find out the truth a little bit, but also just extend that love and that grace towards our relatives, but also let them know that you're interested and you want to know about the history of your people. And it does, some of that painful past starts at the boarding school. There's colonization, but the boarding school really had such a tremendous impact on our people. And so it really starts with that seeking that knowledge, and also forgiveness for like I feel guilty. I don't fully speak my language. I know pieces of it, but it's my responsibility to learn so that my children can find a better path forward. So it really starts with self.
And I think it's, very easy to focus on the amount of things that we have lost and the amount of things that we don't have anymore. And so my question for Sam is, how do we find the balance between recognizing the things that we have lost, but also looking forward towards the things that we have gained and the strength and the resilience of our communities?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question, and I think just following sort of the lines of thought from Deb, it's there's so much good medicine in our language, in our cultures, in our ceremonies. It's language back, land back, culture back. It's all of that back. And we have to recognize that even if we know about the realities of historical trauma and intergenerational trauma, it doesn't mean that we're healed from it, but that is an important piece, right? So as you mentioned, that we do have to recognize and confront that, but we have to be able to address that in ways that make sense for our bloodlines, right? Like, we do have the medicine to be able to heal from this. It's also not just an individual thing, though, as this sort of colonized society that we all kind of swim and breathe in and just exist in. So often the best practices or evidence based on Western ways of thinking are, well, here's a book to learn about your history, here's a book to learn about your language, here's a book to learn about your culture, or a one-day seminar or a week or whatever it might be. These are often good places to start, but they can often be really only band-aids. And so we have to start decolonized ways of thinking, moving away from those constructions of colonized society that say, you're broken, this is how you're fixed. We are not broken people. We are not. We have strength within ourselves. Our bodies are acting the way that they are supposed to under the conditions that we have been raised in, that our parents, our grandparents, that our ancestors were raised in. It's important to recognize that over generations, the federal Indian boarding school policies lasted for over 150 years, generations, for us to meaningfully, truly become the people that we were meant to be, and to find healing. It's not going to be an individual struggle. We have to do the work that we know that our children and our grandchildren and generations that follow us, that is the healing that we need to be keeping in mind generations into the future. And so another part of that is resources too, because so often healing can be looked at as sort of a bypassing. Oh, you just need to heal from this and move on, right? Like these are the kinds of conversations that need to be confronted head on. Healing also means the capability of being able to engage in the type of healing with the resources necessary to be able to direct the means of healing for ourselves. And so we know that taxpayer dollars were spent to create these policies and to reinforce and uphold policies of assimilation and genocide. And so for generations, it's going to take generations to be able to repair and restore our ways of being and our ways of life. It's going to be hard work, but resources are also important to be able to have that healing in community, that healing for our nations. And so with that, there's a responsibility for those actors that compelled these systems to be in the first place, a responsibility to be in that seat to support the restoration. We lead that, but those resources need to come from those actors that created these systems.
Neil, you have the last question.
I think, my last question, I think that we would be great to end on would be, what is something that you want non-natives and natives alike who may not know much about boarding schools and boarding school history to take away from the stories that are being shared and the history that is being shared?
Well, I would say, and that's another great question, Neely. I would say that it's time to listen. It's time to take a moment from our busy lives and listen to others. We are all human beings here, and we have a story to tell. And if we want a better future for tomorrow, for our children, for the earth, then we must listen. We must breathe in what other people have experienced before. We must look at generational ways of being and knowing, and then also take that moment to be in the present. My 26-year-old son told me to share with others, Mom, tell them what you told me, which is to go out into the woods, go to the river, go someplace sacred and find yourself. So let's stop repeating these human rights violations. Let's stop hurting one another, and let's find a space and an understanding of why we're here today in this day and time. And what is it that we need to know? What is it that we need to experience for ourselves in this day and time? So let's get back to being human. Let's get back to a more peaceful way of living and of understanding. And so, with all of the chaos happening in this world, let's recenter ourselves in a better way, because if we don't do that today, then our future generations will keep making those same mistakes. We will keep hurting others. We'll keep hurting ourselves through our own anger or pain or sorrow. And so, healing ourselves today, there's medicine out in the in the water, in the mountains, and in ways that are needed for our spirit and our soul. And that really is just connecting back to the earth, connecting back to positive vibrations and understanding. So that's what I would say, is we need to get back to the core of taking care of our spiritual self.
Deborah, that's powerful, very powerful. Samuel, do you have anything to add?
I love what Deb has to say about honoring the spirit and making sure that we are grounded in a place of operating in a place of strength and continuing to grow our minds and growing our spirits and deepening kinship. And I think connected to that also is sort of this collective responsibility that we do belong to each other, native and non-native alike. Each of us holds a very important responsibility. It is by no accident that the history and impacts of the federal Indian boarding school policies have been systematically swept under the rug and have been endeavored to be forgotten. That is not an accident. that is actually connected to the ongoing problematics of manifest destiny and the doctrine of discovery. These myths that have allowed certain histories to be uplifted and others to be relegated to the margins, or really outside of the national consciousness, the social consciousness at all. And I think so often when we lead with love, a love that is a radical kind of love, a love and a kinship that resembles that we belong to each other. I think sometimes it takes folks by surprise, and they think, well, how come we can't just heal and get over it? But love, radical love and kinship, means that we have to challenge each other and that everybody has a role. And I love the words, I'm going to borrow the words from James Baldwin, where he states, if I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things you don't see. And so that type of radical love means that everybody has a responsibility. We have to continue these conversations. While boarding school policies and the impacts of historical trauma are not yet, in our education systems comprehensively, they need to be. And we need to be having conversations to compel those kinds of shifts in a social and a national consciousness so that we can confront this history, so that we can restore those ways of being that have been sought for extermination, frankly. We're talking about the impacts of genocide. So that type of love requires everyone to be involved in some way, shape, or form, to call elected officials to make sure that our boarding school truth and healing commission bill is passed, to make sure that the organizations that we're a part of are conscious of how certain folks are benefited from these policies and what we can do to address certain disparities. It's going to require everyone, and likely for generations.
I think.
Go ahead.
On behalf of Levi and I and Native News Online, I want to thank you too for joining us and taking time out of your day to join us for this live stream. And I want to say miigwech for all the work that you guys are doing in the community to help us heal from such a huge tragedy.
And I want to thank both of you coming to Deborah and Samuel. It was truly amazing, and I almost feel like we're all on the road to healing together. We at Native News Online and what you guys do at NABS is so important. We're on a journey together, and so feel free to email, call me if you ever have anything new to add, and we can keep you on another edition of Native Bidaské, because this is such a critical topic in Indian country. And as Assistant Secretary Newland said the day the report was released, there's not one single Native American family has not been negatively impacted by Indian boarding schools. So it's something that we keep on top of our mind, and it's something we live with, and we're on a journey together. So chi miigwech for coming on. And to our viewers, yes, and to our viewers, thank you for tuning in, and we will see you next week on Native Bidaské. Deborah, you got one more word. You can finish this up.
In our Lushootseed language, I want to say Haichkasiem. Thank you to the Native News Online for this time to help share a story.
Thank you. Chi miigwech.
If you appreciate what we do here at Native News Online, we invite you to donate to support our continued work covering Indian country. You can scan this code with your smartphone or go to the link located below this video to donate today. We greatly appreciate your support. Please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And be sure to scan this code or go to the link below to subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you for joining us today, and please be sure to join us again next week for another episode of Native Bidaské. Chi miigwech.